LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the June 7th edition of LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. This week I have the 15 best, most newsworthy clips that I picked out from the Sunday morning news analysis shows, plus a couple other spots, but mostly from those shows that come from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for what should be a really informative, educational, fair use media criticism and political commentary show for you all tonight. The source of all of my clips, so I dropped my clip list, is in my clip list. If you want to follow along on the notes I use to remind myself what I wanted to say, there's a link down in the video description to that. There's also a link to the source of all the clips, all the shows, except Fox and Friends. My political comedy clip is coming from Fox and Friends. If you're watching as a live viewer, I didn't put a link down to Fox and Friends, but I'll do that for the recorded show. My topic this week is defunding the police. This slogan, I guess, that a lot of people on the progressive left have been coalescing around this last week. There are actually three big topics this week. First, of course, COVID-19, the coronavirus continues. It's not a solved problem, and there are a lot of worries, especially about how the demonstrations may actually increase the spread, and that was mentioned somewhat on the shows. I will talk about it in passing. And then a second big topic that I'm going to briefly talk about, and you'll see in the news summaries, is the big pushback, especially from the military, against Trump's attempt to deploy active service military members on to the streets of the United States, not just calling up the National Guard, but actually active duty service members. And there was almost like a revolt in the military against, his former defense secretary, Jim Mattis. Well, you'll see it in the news summaries, and that isn't what I'm mostly going to cover. I'm mostly going to cover the big topic, the systemic racism in our policing system, how to fight it. One of the reasons that I think that I should mainly cover that topic is because if you've been looking at my bookcase for the last 7 years, you've been seeing The New Jim Crow, which is about how mass incarceration, our criminal justice system is a system of social and racial control akin to the old Jim Crow system and slavery before that. You'll also see this book, Chokehold, right here from Paul Butler, about the impact of the criminal justice system on black men and basically how the system has them in a chokehold. It's sort of a prophetic title for the whole George Floyd situation. Also, over this shoulder, you'll see Patrisse Cullors' book, When They Call You a Terrorist. She's one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. I will have a clip of Alicia Garza, one of the other co-founders, later, talking about defunding the police. Oh, and then also A Colony in a Nation, Kris Hayes' book. There's another good book about why there is this huge revolt against the oppressive, racist criminal justice system. I'm wearing my Black Lives Matter Sacramento t-shirt that I bought several years ago, and I've been involved with Black Lives Matter in, not centering myself. I've been like a supportive ally, and my role has not been great. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it's something I've been interested in and working to some extent on for several years, and I've talked about for years on the program, so that is why I'm going to talk to you about defunding the police. Now, I've seen some people on the right say, if the Democrats run on defunding the police, Trump is going to win. It's the one thing that's going to make him win. And they think it's like this wedge issue that's going to separate some people from the Democrats and help Republicans win. And that might be true. I don't know if that's true. But one thing I do know about defund the police is I think it's actually a bridge between the progressive left and the mainstream Democratic Party, where I'll show you like Cory Booker later saying, he doesn't want to say the words defund the police, but he agrees with the goals when you really understand what it means. And I'm going to show you clips and explain to you what defund the police really means, because or the fact that it can mean different things to different people. It doesn't necessarily mean abolish the police or dismantle the police, although some people on, really pushing the envelope, that's what they want. And I'm going to show you the second clip I'm going to show you is a 5-minute explanation that I think bridges both sides really well. But before I get to that, I want to show you how they demonized Defund the Police on Fox and Friends Saturday. And the way they discussed it was they had a panel. This is not a joke. This is real. They had a panel of 3 police to discuss whether they agreed with defunding the police. And then you'll see, I'm not going to show you that entire panel, but later it's like a 3-hour show, and they kept coming like every hour back to demonizing defunding the police, and they like unironically referred to their own police panel as evidence to support their point over in this clip.
Look at this map. The effort to defund the police is coast to coast. Los Angeles, San Fran, Phoenix, Nashville, New York, Boston, Minneapolis, Philadelphia. The problem is, particularly the most vulnerable are poor communities. They have no choice where to live. Less cops, let alone no cops, will make their lives incredibly more difficult. We had a police panel in the last hour. Here is their take on these defunding efforts.
This is a dangerous idea, and it's an insane idea. Who exactly is going to police that neighborhood? Who is going to take care of the law-abiding citizens, the hardworking citizens who are just trying to make a living?
Replacing a police officer that's trained both in psychology and in physicality, being able to stop it, no, that's not a good idea at all.
We know that 99.9% of the men and women that put on a uniform every single day are going to protect and serve the communities that they work in. These men and women are really trying to do their jobs to the best of their ability in all communities that are served.
That last guy there, 99.9%. Last week I said 10% bad apples, 10% whistleblowers, and 80% in the middle who cover for the bad apples and try to get rid of the whistleblowers. And I admitted I just made those numbers up because, for all I know, they're wildly different. But I don't think they're 99.9% like that last guy said. The guy before that, he was talking about whether psychologists can go out and deal with domestic violence, and he's talking about how police officers are trained in physicality and psychology. Well, how much psychology training do police officers get? Is it 8 weeks, maybe? I don't know. Is it a year? But they don't, most police officers I've met don't really come across having a lot of a psychological background. And then did you see the Chiron, the title under that first guy? He wasn't like the national president of the Fraternal Order of Police. He was Ational, not national. That, I guess it's just a typo. I make plenty of typos. But before I move on to the clip I promised, which is one of the members of the Minneapolis City Council, Phillipe Cunningham, he was on the Obama Foundation town hall last Wednesday. There's a link in the video description to the entire 1-hour town hall, and what Obama said got a lot of airtime and coverage, but I actually thought what Phillipe Cunningham said when he was talking to the moderator, whose last name is also Cunningham, it's Brittany Packnett Cunningham. It starts off with the moderator talking about what it means to defund the police, and there was a big moment regarding defunding the police this week for me. I wanted to point out that I've also put a link down in the video description to the ACLU of Northern California statement, where the nonprofit, the ACLU of Northern California, here you can see this paragraph, where they're calling for defunding of police and investment in communities. And the ACLU of Northern California, some people call it radical or leftist, but it's actually been much more of an incremental institutional player over the years. So this is a big move for the ACLU of Northern California. And actually one of my experiences working with the ACLU of Northern California, I've been on the finance committee for, actually there are 2 corporations, a 501c3 and a 501c4. That's probably more than you want to know, but for I think 9 years I've been on the finance committee, where we handle the budget and make recommendations to the board on the budgets. And one of the things, and it's multi-million-dollar budgets, and one of the things I've learned over the years is that choice of where you put the money in your budget, that is one of the most important choices. And as you'll see at both the beginning and end of this next clip, budgets are really moral documents where you make really important moral choices, and that's what defunding the police is all about. It's shifting where the money goes in the budget, and I will talk about that with you a little more after we watch this 5-minute explanation from Phillipe Cunningham on or in the Obama Foundation video that there's a link to down there. But this was the 5 minutes that really caught me last Wednesday here.
That's actually what I really want to ask you about, because as an elected official, you are playing a role in a traditional system, but you're also having radical imagination about what's possible. We know that budgets are moral documents, and we know that as we see some cities investing more in policing, they are divesting from housing and jobs and the things that keep people well and keep their needs met. So how are you thinking about the demands that are coming directly from grassroots activists and enacting the most imaginative and bold, even though, as we said earlier, they should just be the things that people receive? How are you thinking about enacting those things, and where does Minneapolis have to go to ensure that everybody there is not just living in a liberal city, but that they're living in an equitable city?
That's right. Thank you for framing it that way. So when I talk about the work that needs to be done, what we have seen is that a lot of reform efforts that have been implemented, we had tremendous leadership from our former mayor, Minneapolis Mayor Betsy Hodges, who came into office unabashedly demanding major overhauls in the Minneapolis Police Department. She appointed the first woman police chief, who is also Native, and the first out LGBT police chief. Every officer was trained in procedural justice and anti-bias training. A community engagement team was created. Then she appointed our city's first Black police chief, Chief Arredondo, whose vision for what's possible for policing is inspiring and what we would all like to see for policing. But even with all of that work, many officers have been in all but open revolt against these efforts, with their grievances being aired by the Police Federation. So when we take a step back and look at the big picture about what does it mean to keep our community safe, we have to be thinking about it from a different frame, a different paradigm. We know that the system of policing is it's founded on and rooted in white supremacy and a history of slave catching. And so as we're trying to do this work of reforming police culture and the institution of policing overall, we have to get serious about investing in new alternative systems of public safety that are rooted in justice and our community. We have a paradigm for this. It's the public health approach to public safety. So thinking about violence as a disease that spreads, as a contagious disease, it spreads interpersonally and it spreads intergenerationally. And so there are evidence-based strategies. We in Minneapolis have been working very closely with John Jay College, as well as their National Network for Safe Communities, as well as Cities United. We've all been working together to really institutionalize this opportunity. I have been a tireless advocate for violence prevention and intervention efforts. We created in late 2018 the Office of Violence Prevention through city ordinance. So now it can't be taken away. We institutionalized a new system, but that only goes so far. We need money to go into that. And that's where the budget as a moral document comes in. There's always political will to put more money into the police budget. The police budget in Minneapolis is almost $200 million. And we have right now, we approved last year a budget of $1.6 billion. They take up a huge chunk. I had to fight relentlessly to get $50,000 for a domestic violence intervention program strategy for us to implement, despite the fact that in Minneapolis, the number one reason for 911 initiated police calls for service is because of domestic assault. We are not successfully getting to the roots of these issues. So having a systemic, institutionalized, new approach to public safety that is community-led, that invests in community with the prevention and intervention, as well as thinking big, even moving further upstream, thinking about housing, jobs, employment, training, education, thinking about all of that. That is what true comprehensive public safety is. And we have to start thinking about what does it look like to have a future without police? What would it look like for us to not need police, and then work backwards from there?
I used to be a teacher, so backwards planning from everything that is possible is my jam. That's my favorite thing to do. And I'm so glad that you really helped root us in the concept of, again, radical imagination and then action toward that.
So radical imagination and action towards that. The budget is a moral document. You heard Phillipe Cunningham there talk about how there's $200 million in the Minneapolis budget for police, and he had to scrounge to get $50,000 for this violence prevention program that could be more effective, is more evidence-based, and is, a radical reimagining. He talked about the racist roots of police departments. That is definitely historically true. And there's kind of a bridge there between the budgetary changes, and then by the end of the explanation you have imagining a world without police, and then that's the radical imagination, and then steps how you get there, but it's not immediately abolishing the police, even though that might be for some on the most, pushing the envelope on the left there. Abolishing the police is definitely the already stated goal, but defunding the police, like I said, is a bridge. And when I get to, what are the clips? Here's the clip list again. The clips, clip 9 and 10, where I juxtapose Cory Booker as the mainstream Democrat who won't say he wants to defund the police, with Alicia Garza, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, and she even comments on what Cory Booker said. I think you'll see there especially how it's a bridge. And when I first heard defund the police as the ACLU position earlier this week, I put up this statement. I was a little worried that all the work for reform that I've been trying to do with a lot of other people over the last several years, that was no longer even an issue, but those are still steps towards the ultimate, radically imagined goal. And if you read the statement, it says, we have to advance urgently needed reforms of our local police departments. The repetition of unjustifiable homicides and shootings must cease, replaced by broad changes to law enforcement policies, practices, and cultures. Over the past decade, with the extraordinary leadership of people impacted by police violence, California has passed meaningful legislation to gain access to racial profiling data, open misconduct records, and impose limits on police use of deadly force. Each of these laws must be faithfully and immediately implemented, which requires pressure from the public and activists and leadership from elected officials. This year, our focus is on continuing to hold police accountable, limiting the potential for abuse, and shifting resources away from police and towards community-based initiatives that support true safety, health, and well-being. To that end, we are a signatory to a letter by the Movement for Black Lives calling for defunding of police and reinvestment in communities. So we're still working for reform, but we have this ultimate goal of making sure that our budgets reflect what actually works, and not the police that are often called to do jobs that they're just not well suited to do. Even a lot of police officers, not on the Fox and Friends panel, but a lot of police officers will admit that some of the jobs they're asked to do, they don't, they're hammers, and not every problem is a nail, to use one of those aphorisms, I guess. But I want to get to the news summaries before I get to the newsmaker clips like Cory Booker, and also I'll have a couple clips of Chad Wolf, the acting Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, trying to defend the Trump administration position. Ben Carson from Housing and Urban Development will also be trying to defend the Trump administration position. And like I said, Cory Booker, Alicia Garza, and then Bill Barr, Attorney General Bill Barr. He never asked about defunding the police, but did answer a question about systemic racism. That I took a clip for that, and then Val Demmings, who's a possible Joe Biden vice presidential pick. That will be the final news clip I'm going to show you. But like I said, the first news summary, actually the first two news summaries are NBC and ABC. They happen to be exactly the same length. Often I'm talking about how, well, NBC News Meet the Press is longer, so maybe that's why it's the best one. I actually think both the NBC News Meet the Press and ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos, they both have 4-minute, 41-second news summaries. And Actually, the one from ABC is much more focused on the military, and I'll talk about that when I get to that clip. But first, here is Chuck Todd on Meet the Press talking about possible multiple inflection points, the Floyd protest, the whole military thing, and there's actually some polls that show that people think America is out of control. I wonder why they would think that. There's only a pandemic and national protests going on at the same time, but that is talked about in most of the news summaries, including the Meet the Press news summary that I probably over-introduced, and we'll talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Good Sunday morning. We have reached at least one inflection point in America, perhaps two. The killing of George Floyd has set off nearly 2 weeks of mostly peaceful protests in scores of cities across the country and the world. Some of the largest of them yesterday, awakening white America to the reality of police brutality and uniting a multiracial coalition to say, enough. At the same time, the clearing of protesters near the White House to make way for a presidential photo opportunity has succeeded in uniting current and former military leaders to denounce the use of force against peaceful assembly and to say, enough. From the brutal police killing to the marches, to the 110,000 Americans dead from the coronavirus, to the tens of millions now unemployed, there's a growing sense that things are spinning beyond our grasp in this country. This is the scene here in Washington, where the White House has become a fortress, behind new fencing and concrete barriers. In fact, in our latest NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, fully 80% of all registered voters tell us that the country is out of control. Just 15% believe things are currently under control. Still, President Trump's approval rating stands pretty much where it's been for the last 2 years. 45% approve, 53% disapprove. And what does this all mean for November? Well, it remains a very stable election. Joe Biden's lead over President Trump is a very durable 7 points, 49-42. And it's exactly where things stood in our poll 2 months ago. And now both candidates are challenged with facing a moment when an increasingly vocal public is demanding change and declaring that Black Lives Matter.
It may not be in my lifetime, but it may be in these young people's lifetime that racism and injustice will be wiped out.
For nearly 2 weeks, thousands of protesters across the country and around the world have captured a shift in public attitudes on race and policing.
Our ancestors built this ground that we're all standing on. We built this country and we feel like we deserve to be here.
There is a change in mindset that's taking place, a greater recognition that we can do better.
In our poll, majorities of African Americans, Hispanics, and whites all say they are more concerned about the actions of the police in the George Floyd killing than about some protests which have turned violent. Floyd remembered on Saturday at a memorial service in North Carolina where he was born. And Breonna Taylor at a vigil in Louisville, Kentucky. Use of force policies are being re-examined across the country, with new moments of violence caught on camera this week. In Buffalo, New York, a 75-year-old man pushed back by police on Thursday, his head hitting the ground. In New York City, a police officer caught on camera pushing a woman to the ground, another pulling down a man's mask and pepper spraying him in the face. In Philadelphia, a police staff inspector facing aggravated assault charges after hitting a Temple University student with a baton during a confrontation. At the same time, in other cases, protesters have attacked police with rocks and bottles. The president has embraced the idea of military units in the streets of the Capitol.
You have to dominate the streets. You can't let what's happening happen. It's called dominate the streets.
We're out here peacefully protesting, but they're armed like they're going to war.
Mr. Trump is hoping to run as a law and order candidate again.
I am your president of law and order.
And is lamenting the chaos he presides over. On Monday, the government used physical force, dispersing peaceful protesters with chemical agents and flash grenades, clearing the way for the president's photo op in front of St. John's Episcopal Church. Prompting criticism from his former defense secretary, James Mattis. Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us.
General Mattis's letter was stunning and powerful.
I respect General Mattis. He has every right to express his opinion. That's his opinion.
And these comments from former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly.
I think we should look at people that are running for office and put them through the filter. What is their character like? What are their ethics? Are they willing, if they're elected, to represent all of their constituents, not just the base?
And joining me now is Democratic Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. Senator.
Like I said, I will have a Cory Booker clip coming up, and I still think Meet the Press had the best all-around coverage of the Trump wrongdoing, the military pushback against Trump's, attempt to perform fascism or whatever you are going to call what he did on Monday, and his, dominating the battle space or dominating the streets. You got to dominate the streets, dominate the battle spaces, Mike Esper apparently said, and then said that he should have used different words. And anyway, I thought that was a good all-around news summary. And by the way, I noticed while I was looking at the live comments, I got quite a few super chat contributions. $20 from Sexy Bob. And thank you for recognizing that I have a lot of time and emotion invested in the Black Lives Matter movement, even though I'm just a supportive ally. And then Noni Cosio there pressed the join button and went to the Constitution level, which means that I'm supposed to send you this sticker and this ACLU Constitution, and you're the second person to sign up at a level where I'm supposed to send you something by pressing the join button. And do you have like a Twitter account that you could post in the live comments? Because I found out YouTube has no way for me to contact you and get a shipping address from you over YouTube. But if you follow me on Twitter and confirm, if you have a Twitter account, or maybe through Facebook or somehow, I have to get your shipping address so I can send you your hashtag LiberalViewer sticker and your ACLU Constitution. So I don't know. I will look through the live comments later. Noni Cosio, if I'm even pronouncing that close to correctly, if you have some way that I can contact you to get your address. But I talked a little bit about the juxtaposition of the NBC and ABC news summaries before I showed the NBC News Meet the Press clip. Oh, did I thank everyone who gave me a super chat contribution? I guess not. Also, Kamashwari Kate, $2 and then $12. I saw in the live comments that you had said that you meant to give $12 when you gave $2, so I guess I got an extra $2 Canadian out of that, and I don't even know what the exchange rate is, but I appreciate all the super chat contributors. Last week's show, by the way, was demonetized after manual review. Someone watched it and said advertisers do not want to advertise on last week's show. America Broken. I think possibly, since I'm talking about racism, that might happen again this week. Who knows? But that's why I appreciate the super chat contributors, the Patreon contributors. There's a link down in the video description to Patreon, and those people who press that join button and contribute monthly through YouTube. So thanks for that. But anyway, the juxtaposition of the ABC and NBC News Meet the Press, ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and NBC News Meet the Press news summaries, that was the best all-around news summary. ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos co-host Martha Raddatz was the host this week. And I've talked about her many times over the years about how she has this interesting role as a reporter where she's really close to a lot of military sources, which gives her a lot of access and a lot of good reporting, but sometimes she seems to be like a messenger for the military. And in this story, it doesn't really make much difference at all because the military is pushing back against Trump, so there's no pro-military spin that is obscuring the actual story in this case, I don't think, or you can let me know what you think down in the comment section. But what I think is great about this is that ABC did what NBC normally does, where Chuck Todd gives his live introduction and then he does a transition to the pre-recorded package pre-recorded video that he narrates. Well, Martha Raddatz did that, but her pre-recorded package includes her going to the streets. It's like Martha Raddatz hits the streets of D.C. to talk to the protesters, which I thought was kind of cool. And then there's a map here of where the protests are all across the United States, which I not only thought was like a cool map, but it made me think, I said COVID-19, coronavirus has not gone away. I've been watching the protests, even like the local protests here in Sacramento, and I was really impressed at the beginning of the video. I saw that like over 95% of the people were wearing masks. But like a couple hours into the protests, a lot of those masks were down on the chin. I'd say it was more like 60% of people were wearing masks. And there's some evidence maybe that COVID-19 doesn't spread as well outside, but I'm worried that the map you're going to see in this ABC News news summary of where all the protests are, that might also be where they're going to be COVID-19 outbreaks in a couple weeks. But anyway, I'll talk about this news summary a little more after we watch it together over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. It has been nearly 2 weeks of demonstrations and mourning in America. George Floyd's death in police custody sparking the broadest protests in U.S. history, according to an analysis from the Washington Post. Their map showing the scope of the demonstrations. Overnight, cities remained largely calm across the country. In Washington, the White House, the People's House, even more fortified with new fences. On Friday, President Trump talked briefly about equal justice under the law for every American, but his law and order response to the demonstrators has drawn fierce criticism and condemnation from all 4 living former presidents, the presumptive Democratic nominee, and one prominent GOP senator openly questioning whether she can support Trump in November. But perhaps the most notable responses from those who seldom enter the political arena, now breaking their silence as protesters show no sign of quieting down. A sea of protesters in the nation's capital Saturday. Why was it important for you to come today?
I want to make my ancestors proud.
Among the crowd, we met Anika Rumpf, a nurse, and Andrew Pepler, an Army vet.
Everybody's standing in solidarity for Black lives.
Many congregating at what is now a visual symbol of rising tensions here in Washington. Many of the protesters were concentrated around the White House down 16th Street, where that Black Lives Matter was written on the road. This protest, one of many across the nation, part of what is now a tapestry of stunning scenes this week in D.C. Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter! A military helicopter overhead. Humvees typically seen in combat zones. As you get closer and closer to the White House, far more military vehicles and National Guard. And on Monday, the forceful removal of peaceful protesters exercising their First Amendment right outside the White House, clearing the way for a presidential photo op. Is that your Bible?
State Bible.
The president with this threat.
If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
You heard the president probably today talk about sending in active duty military.
Yeah, I served in the military. I actually just got out last year. And I think most of my brothers and sisters in the military would struggle with that order.
There were more than 43,000 National Guard members in 34 states this week activated to respond to civil unrest, more than 5,000 of them in D.C., many spread over the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. There is a big demonstration here tonight, a peaceful demonstration, and dozens of guardsmen behind me protecting the Lincoln Memorial. From the National Guard out in force at the monuments to the streets where protesters face off with these citizen soldiers, neighbor on neighbor.
What I see is banana republic tactics. The military in the United States does not enforce local population. That's just not how we do it here.
After calling for states to dominate the battle space,
in retrospect, I would use different wording.
The defense secretary is backtracking and breaking with the president.
I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
Active duty troops in the D.C. region are heading home, but Trump's threat has already contributed to deepening divides between him and top military leaders. 89 former defense officials writing, "Our military must never be used to violate the rights of those they are sworn to protect." Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullins, saying, "We are at an inflection point." And former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis with a blistering rebuke, telling me enough is enough. Also writing, "We must reject and hold accountable those in office who would make a mockery of our Constitution." So let's get the latest on the protests yesterday in the nation's capital with the D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser.
And D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser was on a couple different programs. I don't have any clips of her. By the way, I saw that Noni Cosio did post an address for me, and then I deleted it because that's the whole reason I was asking about the whole Twitter thing, is because I didn't want someone to have to post their address in the live comments, which are saved and then rebroadcast later. So I deleted that comment, but that Noni Cosio posted the address. But thank you. I didn't delete it because there was anything bad about it. That's actually for your privacy. I deleted that comment, but I copied your address and deleted your comment. Thank you. And like I said, I think I pretty much pre-criticized or contextualized the Martha Raddatz report there. It was much more focused on the military pushback against Trump, although a lot of the same important facts that were in the NBC News Meet the Press news summary were also there from ABC. The next news summaries are shorter. Well, the shortest one was actually CNN's State of the Union, where Jake Tapper started off, as he does every week, with what is the State of the Union this week, and it's reckoning. I guess that's reckoning with our racial past, or reckoning with the problems of our society. And he talks about how tens of thousands of people protested peacefully. That is, you'll see when I get to the Fox News summary, they say mostly peacefully. They downplay the peacefulness. And also you'll see Jake Tapper talk about Black Lives Matter being put on the streets of Washington, D.C., and then also about the tweets, the Trump tweets. Because CNN really, even though it's only a 1 minute, 17-second news summary, CNN always likes to point out the Trump misconduct, which I appreciate as a viewer, but not everybody does. And I will talk about that a little more after we watch that news summary together over here.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the state of our union is reckoning. Tens of thousands of Americans taking to the streets Saturday, protesting peacefully for racial justice, filling cities and towns across the country, and frankly, citizens filling the streets around the world. In Washington, D.C., thousands of protesters gathered around the White House, where the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, had the street painted with the words "Black Lives Matter." This weekend, the images were mostly peaceful, showing people gathering, holding up signs, kneeling. Not the chaos and violence that we saw in some of the first few nights. President Trump is in Washington this weekend in a newly fortified White House as demonstrators call for justice. The president kept his response focused on his own message, tweeting nothing about racial justice, but instead declaring, quote, "law and order," and claiming that D.C.'s peaceful protest over the brutal murder of George Floyd by police officers was, quote, "much smaller than anticipated." This after a week in which the president's threats to dominate American streets drew unprecedented condemnation from top-level former military leaders, including his former Secretary of Defense, General James Mattis. Joining me now in a State of the Union exclusive, former Secretary of State and former Joint Chiefs Chairman
Colin Powell. Colin Powell said he's voting for Biden, but he also voted against Trump last time and voted for Obama, so I don't know how that's big news, and he's not that big a political player, so I have no Colin Powell clips. And I think I misrepresented. He did say the protests were mostly peaceful, which I was saying that, no, that's what Fox News said, but that's actually what CNN said. But he did also concentrate on Trump misconduct, which I appreciate. And the one thing I forgot to show after the ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos or Martha Raddatz news summary was that cool map that I was saying might, that I was saying might end up being like where are the COVID-19 outbreaks. That's where all the protests were. So 2 weeks from now, is that where we're going to start seeing an uptick in COVID-19 outbreaks? I don't know, but that's what I thought of when I saw that map in the ABC news summary, and I forgot to show that after the last clip. The next two news summaries are a little bit different. Sometimes I've said CBS News' Face the Nation is Fox News light. And they're not as bad as Fox News, which is, of course, like a propaganda arm of the Republican Party. And that's what it was created to be. If you read this book over here, The Loudest Voice in the Room by Gabriel Sherman. The rest of the media has their own biases towards, superficiality, towards sensationalism, towards, what bleeds is what leads. That's sensationalism, I guess. And also towards corporate bias. I don't think they're going to, since the police are there to protect property, they started, like you heard in that clip from the Obama Foundation people, they started as like slave catchers. That's the ultimate protection of the property of the 1% or whatever, because not many people ever own slaves in the United States. But so that's corporate media biases towards corporate property holders, like big rich people or whatever. But another thing they also seem to have this bias for that I mention all the time is that when they have exclusive guests, they skew their coverage towards the exclusive guest. And CBS News' Face the Nation had a really big exclusive guest this week, Bill Barr, the Attorney General, or he's supposed to be the Attorney General, but he often acts like the personal lawyer for Donald Trump. And sometimes I think he's like the most sinister person in that administration because, he talks, he in some way, I saw who was it, the pundit who said this week that Bill Barr reminded them of Dick Cheney because he doesn't yell and get all, he doesn't foam at the mouth. He almost like whispers things that are just like terrible and anti-constitutional and destroying the norms and the rule of law, but he presents it like some people say he looks almost like a little teddy bear, but he's like the teddy bear of death. No, I don't know, the teddy bear of the destruction of our republic. I don't know, but Bill Barr is pretty nasty, and they got an exclusive interview, and they didn't even show all of it. The link down in the video description is the CBS News Face the Nation YouTube channel, where I think they may have the full interview that includes parts that they didn't even show on the program that I watched. They never asked him about defunding the police, but they did ask him about briefly about systemic racism, and I will show that clip. That is clip number 13. But first, clip number 6 here is the CBS News Face the Nation news introduction, which is briefly Margaret, Brennan, and then this guy who I don't remember seeing before, Kris Van Cleave, who does cover some of the same facts you saw in the other news summary, but then focuses on this military revolt against Trump's attempt to use active military forces on the streets of the United States. And they have some exclusive reporting from the Justice Department. It sounds like it might be Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, because it tries to make Mark Esper and Bill Barr look good. And later in parts of the interview I'm not going to show, he denies that Trump demanded that active military troops be put on the streets, but his denial makes it sound like he didn't demand they be deployed, he demanded they be activated. And there was a lot of pushback from Bill Barr and from Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, which is heavily covered in this news summary that I've way over introduced, but we'll talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. Across the country, there is a collective sigh of relief following a day and night in which the vast majority of protests were peaceful. But America's widening racial divide, on top of the nation's economic and medical crisis, is painful. Political commentator Bakari Sellers may have put it best when he told our CBS This Morning colleagues, "This is like 1918 meets 1968. You have a great pandemic and you have a country that is teetering on edge." With that, we begin with Kris Van Cleave. He has been covering the protests in the streets of the nation's capital since they began.
Margaret, good morning. A week ago, this fencing wasn't here. It is separating where the protests have been from the White House and has become a bit of a mural. Now, early this morning, we want to show you some video. D.C.'s Mayor Muriel Bowser and Congressman and Civil Rights Leader John Lewis came out here as people were cleaning up from the rally yesterday. The congressman called the protests moving and impressive.
Washington, D.C. besieged by peaceful protest. Huge crowds marched from the Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial, flooding the streets outside the White House, unified in the message painted on the road below their feet: Black Lives Matter.
We just want justice. We just want to stop being killed.
Protests nationally were large and generally peaceful, but it remained tense in Portland, Oregon. After police gave orders to disperse overnight, officers were seen forcing people back with batons. And flashbangs were used to disperse a crowd in Seattle. It's been a week that's torn at the fabric of our nation. The death of George Floyd at the hands of police sparked nights of violence across the country. CBS News has learned Monday morning President Trump demanded 10,000 active duty troops be deployed to major cities. Defense Secretary Mark Esper and Attorney General Bill Barr pushed back in a heated Oval Office meeting. Hours later, this moment, as police in riot gear moved peaceful protesters for a presidential photo op.
7 p.m. Saturday, and what a difference a week makes. Gone are the officers in riot gear, replaced by a sea of peaceful demonstrators with a serious message. They say they're not leaving until they're heard.
We met the Gebra family near the White House. It was 11-year-old Izana's idea to come.
We need to bring attention to these black people dying for no reason.
And throughout this country, a difficult conversation about race, even between protesters and police.
We're here to listen. We're here to hear you out. And, I absolutely commend what you're doing. And
I want more than for you all to hear me out. I want systemic change.
Those 10,000 active duty troops that President Trump wanted were never deployed, but thousands of National Guard from around the country were. D.C.'s mayor is demanding they be sent home. Margaret?
Earlier this morning, I went to the Justice Department to speak with Attorney General Bill Barr. In his role as the nation's top law enforcement...
And like I said, I do have a clip of Bill Barr coming up, clip number 13, although most of the interview is about that story you saw talked about in the news summary I just showed, where they said that Bill Barr and Mark Esper pushed back against Trump wanting to activate or deploy or whatever the word is that Bill Barr is using to claim it's false reporting. And I'm not going to show the clips of him talking about that because, like I said, that isn't the topic I'm mainly covering. I will show him talking about whether there's systemic racism in police. But before I get to all the newsmaker clips, I want to show one more news summary. This is, all the other 4 news summaries are journalistic news summaries. This is something slightly different. All the Trump wrongdoing, except there's a little bit about the pushback against Trump from the military, because the 2 big stories are, you'll see Chris Wallace in the beginning of the Fox News Sunday news summary. The 2 big stories are the protests against what happened to George Floyd, and then the controversy over whether the military should be used to help with the protests, but nothing about systemic racism and defunding the police. Defunding the police did come up briefly a couple times on Fox News Sunday. I don't think it was ever mentioned on CBS News' Face the Nation. I don't know why, but I will talk about all that a little more after we watch the Fox News Sunday news summary. Chris Wallace handing off to Mark Meredith. Still almost could have been written by the press team at the White House, as I will talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. It has been a tough time for America. First, the coronavirus pandemic, which forced the country into lockdown. That caused the loss of millions of jobs. And over the last 2 weeks, mass outrage over racial injustice sent tens of thousands into the streets to protest the killing of George Floyd. Now a fierce national debate over what role the military should play in containing those protests. In a moment, we'll speak with Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf. But first, let's bring in Mark Meredith at the White House with the latest on this weekend's protests. Mark.
Chris, this weekend, demonstrations nationwide remained mostly peaceful as Americans once again came out to show their outrage over George Floyd's death.
From outside the White House to the heart of Philadelphia and as far west as San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge, thousands of Americans on Saturday marched in solidarity against police brutality and in support of social justice.
Officers need to be held to a higher standard. You swore an oath. You studied the law.
In Buffalo, New York, outrage is growing after officers were seen on camera shoving a 75-year-old protester. The man fell backwards, hit his head, and remains in the hospital. The 2 officers involved are facing assault charges. They've pleaded not guilty. President Trump continues to encourage peaceful protesting while also repeating his call for governors to keep law and order.
I hope they also use our National Guard. Call me. We'll be ready for them so fast their heads will spin.
This past week, as protesters gathered in D.C., the White House and nearby buildings were fortified, with officials installing new, tall metal barriers around the People's House.
Tomorrow, House and Senate Democrats will unveil a bill to address police reform. We expect many Democrats to support that effort, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and members of the Congressional Black Caucus. Chris?
Mark Meredith reporting.
And at the end there, you see he talks about the police reform bill that's going to be introduced tomorrow, and I'm going to talk about that later when I show some of the newsmakers talking about it. But it's all Nancy Pelosi in the House Black Caucus, and so far no Republicans, and that's one of the things that Jake Tapper asks Karen Bass about in clip number 11 I'm going to get to in a few moments. But you notice there that they never talked about Trump's photo op at the church and him clearing out the protesters. That did come up in some of the newsmaker interviews, so it's not like no journalism ever happens on Fox News, even though it is a propaganda outlet for the Republican Party. Sometimes journalism does incidentally occur on that program, on that channel. Fox News channel does occasionally broadcast journalism, but that's not the main focus of the channel, and I think that news summary showed that. And I was talking about earlier not only the Fox and Friends clip I showed first in the program as an example of how they're demonizing the whole defund the police movement. I was surprised that in that news summary they showed that clip from Buffalo of cops pushing that 75-year-old man and him falling and hitting his head, and they didn't really show the bleeding, and they said they pled not guilty. They downplayed it a little bit, but that's a lot more police misconduct than you usually see on the Fox News channel. Instead, they usually focus on, all the cops who've been hurt and even killed, and how dangerous a job it is, and how they're, all working to keep us safe and protected. And it's not like there are no police officers like that, but that's just the overwhelming focus on Fox News, and they downplay this whole, they never really even explain the whole defund the police slogan like I showed you in that second clip from Phillipe Cunningham. And in fact, even on Fox News Sunday, one of their most journalistic programs, they only mentioned defund the police a couple times. First in this real softball question to Chad Wolf, the acting director of the Department of Homeland Security, where Chris Wallace just says, here, let me look at my notes because let me get this right here. He says, police reform is a real issue, but, what about this defund the police? Does that make any sense at all? Like, already kind of framing it as like crazy, radical. And of course, Chad Wolf, the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, gives a very negative answer about that with no follow-up from Chris Wallace. In the final question he asked him in the interview clip that I will talk about with you after we watch it together over here.
Let's turn the subject. I think most people would agree that the issue of the protests, the nonviolent protests about injustice in the black community and injustice in policing the black community is a real issue. In Minneapolis, the stats are that the police use force against blacks at a rate 7 times higher than they use it against whites. So there's all kinds of talk about reform. One of the ideas that's being mentioned on the left is to defund the police, to restructure, start over with police departments. Does that make any sense to you?
No, it doesn't. It's an absurd assertion, and I don't understand it. So if you are concerned about the racial injustice, Kris, that you talked about, if you're concerned about needing to reform different police departments or law enforcement agencies, you want to make sure that you're giving them the right training, you're giving them the right oversight and the right leadership to do that so they can continue to protect the countries that they, or the cities that they serve. You don't do that by slashing budgets. It makes no sense to me. I think it's a very political statement to make, but it does not protect our communities at the end of the day.
Mr. Secretary, thank you. Thanks for joining us during this very busy time, sir. Now let's turn to the former...
So that was a pretty softball question, like I said, even from the more journalistic member of the Fox News propaganda organization, Chris Wallace. He framed the question in a way that made it sound a little bit crazy to begin with. You know, the real issue is reform, and does it make any sense, this defund the police, and no follow-up question, no explanation of all the stuff I showed you earlier. Now, I don't think I'm smart enough in terms of being able to predict political outcomes to know whether this defund the police slogan, is it going to drive enough voters away from the Democrats to hurt them in the election against Trump that is now less than 5 months away, right? November 3rd, and what is today, June 7th. So that's less than 5 months away to the election. Does that mean that this defund the police movement is going to hurt Democrats? I don't think Biden's going to say it. I don't think Cory Booker's going to say it. That's the next clip I'm going to show. Cory Booker is definitely a mainstream Democrat. He's not at the progressive edge. I did some volunteer work for the ACLU of New Jersey when he was mayor of Newark, and I don't think he was a cutting-edge progressive at that point. That's my personal opinion. Whenever I talk about ACLU stuff, I should say that everything I say here is my personal opinion. I have no authority to speak for any ACLU organization, even though a long time ago I did some work for the ACLU of New Jersey when Cory Booker was there, but that I can't speak for the ACLU on anything. But the next clip I'm going to show actually is from Cory Booker, like I said, talking to Chuck Todd on NBC News' Meet the Press. And this is, I just said that I'm not smart enough to know whether enough voters are going to be turned off by the defund the police slogan. You know, they want to be kept safe, and it sounds like dismantle the police, abolish the police. Is that going to drive away voters for the Democrats? But like I said, I think it's a bridge between mainstream Democrats, centrist Democrats like Cory Booker, and then the more radical movement progressives like Alicia Garza, who I'm going to show afterwards, where they both have different meanings of defund the police. Cory Booker agrees with the goals but won't endorse the words. And anyway, I will talk about that a little more after we watch Chuck Todd talk to Cory Booker about the slogan defund the police in this clip.
I want to ask you about defunding the police. Last night in Washington, D.C. on 16th Street, right next to the Black Lives Matter letters, the phrase defund the police was painted down there, and that is, there's a lot of passion around that issue. And when you hear that, and the phrase may mean different things to different people, but when you hear that, what's your reaction?
Well, I understand clearly the sentiment and the substance behind the slogan. And so while it's not a slogan I'll use, if people just dismiss it and don't get deeper into the substance, as I said earlier, it is not a mark of a beloved community to prey upon the most vulnerable in your society. We are using police, and as a guy who ran police departments, I would have exhausted police officers saying, why are we using police to deal with the fragility or vulnerability of our society? There's so much money going into our police departments that it's a more expensive way to deal with it. I remember being surprised in Seattle with a housing group called Plymouth Housing, where they showed me a data analysis where they looked at what was more expensive for society, providing supportive housing for Americans with mental illness that were homeless, or leaving them on the streets. And they found out they were able to save Seattle millions of dollars by giving people supportive housing, because homeless people left on the streets with mental illnesses end up in hospital emergency rooms and jails. And so this is the outrage that I think people on the streets are feeling, and that I share, is that we are over-policed as a society, that we are investing in police, which is not solving problems, but making them worse, when we should be in a more compassionate country, in a more loving country. And I know love is at the core of our ideals, but it needs to be made manifest in our policies. We would actually spend less money. We would elevate human dignity and human potential. And we would set a standard on the planet Earth for how we treat those who are vulnerable, as opposed to what we're seeing right now.
Senator, when you were running for president, you were quite critical of former Vice President.
And then he asked him about Biden, and you can see the whole interview with the Meet the Press link down in the video description. But like I said, I think Cory Booker in that clip, he endorses a lot of the things you heard Phillipe Cunningham, the member of the Minneapolis City Council, talk about when he was talking about defunding the police. A lot of the different budget priorities that you saw back in clip 2, if you're following along on your clip list. Well, you saw Cory Booker there in clip 9 endorse a lot of those same programs, a lot of those different budget priorities, but still say he won't say defund the police. He won't use those words because, I mean, see, I think that's the pivot point for the Democratic Party. Some people will, like the ACLU of Northern California has just moved to endorsing defunding the police, but they are still working for reform. There are people on, the far left who are endorsing the phrase defund the police to mean dismantle, abolish the police. And then there's Cory Booker more in the center saying, I won't say defund the police, but I'm endorsing a lot of the different budgetary priorities that people who are saying defund the police actually mean. And a lot of the reforms, there's this whole Justice in Policing Act that I'll talk about more when I show the clip of Karen Bass talking, Representative Karen Bass from California, the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus, talking about the Justice in Policing Act that Cory Booker is also endorsing in the Senate. And that's what's going to happen tomorrow in Congress, trying to reform the police at a federal level. But I want to show first, Alicia Garza was on NBC News' Meet the Press responding to Cory Booker there and talking about what defund the police really means. But one of the weird things about this clip is the clip itself, in some ways, it reifies the marginalization of radical black voices, because you'll see Alicia Garza's audio sort of fades in and out, and that's not my problem. That was on Meet the Press. And then at the end, they try to go to this other guy, this older black man, and he can't hear Chuck Todd on Meet the Press, and they have to go to commercial. It's something I was talking about, was it last week's show or the week before, where I'm really proud of how well I'm able to broadcast from home on my own with no producers, no technical people. I'm like a one-man show here, and I've got most weeks a pretty stable broadcast. I don't want to jinx it. And during COVID-19, I've seen all the corporate network people, when they're trying to broadcast from home, It's like multiple programs have technical difficulties. They can't deal with it, and that's what happens at the end of this NBC News Meet the Press clip. But I still wanted to show you Alicia Garza, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. You know, I have my Black Lives Matter Sacramento t-shirt on, and even though you can't hear everything, and NBC News is showing how black voices get marginalized just in the way they show this clip, which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
When you hear the phrase, when Americans hear the phrase defund the police, you're not calling for defunding police departments and getting rid of police. Explain what you mean by that phrase.
When we talk about defunding the police, what we're saying is invest in the resources that our communities need. So much of policing right now is generated and directed towards quality of life issues, homelessness, drug addiction, domestic violence, and conflicts between people. In order to address those issues. But what we do need is increased funding for housing. We need increased funding for education. We need increased funding for the quality of life of communities who are over-policed and over-surveilled. And so, I heard Senator Booker earlier say, it's not a phrase I would use, but I actually agree with the content. And so I would just ask all of us, are we willing to live in fear that our lives will be taken by police officers who are literally using their power in the wrong way? Or are we willing to adopt and absorb the fear of what it might mean to change our practices, which will ultimately lead to a better quality of life for everyone? And so again, I want to be very, very clear. 7 years ago, people thought that Black Lives Matter was a radical idea. And yet Black Lives Matter is now a household name, and it's something being discussed across kitchen tables all over the world. Why can't we start to look at how it is that we reorganize our priorities so that people don't have to be in the streets protesting during a national pandemic? It's really in a global pandemic. It's time for us to address the pandemic in our communities, and that pandemic is not having the resources we need to live well, and that's not just a Black problem, that's everybody's problem.
Mm-hmm. Is Joe Biden a leader for this moment? Looks Alicia Garza there. My apologies. Our apologies for the technical hiccup there. But I appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective with us. Let me turn now to the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Lonnie Bunch. Lonnie, take a step back. Where are we in this arc of history of where we are in America?
I can't hear what you said.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Lonnie, just take a step back. Where are we on this arc in the story of America and civil rights?
Unfortunately, I can't hear a word you're saying. I don't know what you're saying.
All right. Well, my apologies for that. We're going to go to a quick commercial break while we figure out our audio issues, and we'll be right back.
Is it audio issues, or is it the corporate media marginalizes black voices? I don't know. No, it's like I said, it's I almost used the end of that last clip as my political comedy clip, but I decided to use Fox and Friends from Saturday instead. But sometimes they say the media is the message. I think wasn't that Marshall McLuhan said the media is the message? Well, I think the media was the message in the technical problems in that last clip. And I'm sorry I didn't remember Mr. Bunch's name, the guy from the Smithsonian Institute. I didn't take a clip of him except for him not being able to hear anything Chuck Todd said. And is that a metaphor, or is that just a technical problem? You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. But the next clip I want to show is I mentioned before is Representative Karen Bass, a member of the House of Representatives from California, talking about this, and she's the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus, and she's talking about this Justice in Policing Act that's going to be introduced tomorrow, that Cory Booker was also talking about a little bit, and then she also at the end talks about what defunding the police means. She's sort of in between Cory Booker and Alicia Garza on that issue, which I will talk about a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
We've seen other disturbing videos from the last few days, including one showing police violence in Buffalo when two officers shoved a 75-year-old man to the ground, which resulted in a serious injury for him. In Tacoma, a man died after being forcibly restrained by police. In March, in Atlanta, a woman broke her clavicle after a police officer body slammed her to the ground. I understand that the Congressional Black Caucus, which you chair, is going to present legislation of potential ways to try to stop these kinds of problems. Can you give us an idea of what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Tomorrow we will introduce a bill that covers several areas. One is police accountability. It was shameful what happened to that man. Not only did they push him down, but they walked right past him and then wouldn't even let an officer render aid. Our bill that we're going to be introducing tomorrow, Justice in Policing Act, would cover those. So in other words, those officers shouldn't have, no, when they saw him push the officer down, push the protester down, they should have rendered aid. The other officers should have intervened and said that shouldn't happen. Those are the type of practices that we want to see ended. And with the legislation, with accountability, and with the transparency and the emphasis on training, we believe that we'll be able to address those type of situations. It's time for police culture in many departments to change, and we believe that the legislation will make a major step forward in that direction.
You'll have to get it through the Senate in order for it to become law. Do you have any Republican allies in the Senate on board with the legislation?
Well, let me tell you that we are introducing the bills together. So Senator Harris, Senator Booker are taking the lead over in the Senate. They've been working on that side, and we have work to do in the House as well. But you know what? I think we're in a real moment in our country. The passion that the people are displaying. I'm so glad now that the protesting is peaceful. It's been every day. It's been across the country. I think that it is going to lay the basis for the momentum for us to bring about the change that we need to do. I mean, let me give you an example. Right now, there's no way to track officers that are problematic. So the officer that killed George Floyd, if he was not arrested, he could have simply gone to another jurisdiction and been hired. We need to look at the training that is done with law enforcement. We need to do things in accountability, transparency, and training that we believe would make a big difference. That officer that killed Tamir Rice, who was 12 years old, actually had been fired from another department.
That's right. He'd been fired from the Independence, Ohio Police Department and lied about it on his record when he applied for the, I think, Cuyahoga or Cleveland Police Department.
Exactly.
But just to translate, it sounds like you don't have any. It sounds like you don't have any Republican allies in the Senate as of now. I mean, it's early yet, but sounds like that's what you're saying.
Well, I believe that there would be Senate allies. I'm not over there, so I'm not sure. Rand Paul is one who had been an ally before. Once he gets past the lynching issue, hopefully he'll be an ally again. But I will tell you that in the House, I had a meeting the other day with the Problem Solvers Caucus, and that's a bipartisan caucus. Now, that was before we had the bill. We're going to go back and talk to them now. But I found there was a lot of interest. There was a lot of support. I found out that one of my Republican colleagues was a former police officer. Another one's son is a police officer. They were appalled by what happened to George Floyd, and they believe that no profession wants to have bad apples. And there also needs to be standards, national standards for policing. We need to look at the best practices. I think that there's a lot of things that we can do, but this bill, I believe, is a bold piece of legislation. It's transformative. I've been in Congress 10 years, never seen anything like it.
So, Congresswoman, you're talking about reforming police, but as you know, a lot of people on the left, including CBC member Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, are talking about defunding police department, disbanding police departments. What do you make of those calls?
So, you know what I think is really needed? And I think that part of the movement around defunding is really about how we spend resources in our country. And I think far more resources need to be spent in communities to address a number of problems. Now, I don't believe that you should disband police departments. But I do think that in cities, in states, we need to look at how we are spending the resources and invest more in our communities. So one of the things that we have in the bill is a way to provide grants to community-based organizations around the country so people can begin to say, what is public safety in our community? What do we want to see? Maybe this is an opportunity to re-envision public safety.
Congresswoman Karen Bass, chair of the Congressional Black Caucus.
I don't know, is re-envision public safety better than defund the police? Maybe it should be re-budget the police. I don't know. I saw some live comments while I was watching the clip with you all about defunding the police not being a good slogan, and I don't know whether about the people who are turned off by defund the police. I do like the fact that it means different things to different people. It's kind of simplistic, but it's also not defined, so people can sort of imbue it with what they think it means. Of course, people on the right are going to decide it means abolish the police or dismantle the police, and maybe some people on the left, far left, are going to also see it as abolish and dismantle the police. But it's really more about rebudgeting the police, giving less funds to the police and more funds to evidence-based programs that actually reduce violence and reduce the needs for the police, and also reforming the police for accountability and transparency. I've talked about that for many years. We had SB 1421 here in California that made police misconduct records more accessible to the public, that I talked about years ago and eventually got passed, and AB 392 that changed the police use of force standard here in California that possibly is going to end up getting passed as part of this whole Justice and Policing Act. I don't know if there's going to be a model police use of force standard in there, but Karen Bass called the Justice and Policing Act bold and transformative, but actually I think it's kind of weak from what I've heard so far, but I wait to actually read the legislation when it's introduced tomorrow on Monday. But this is LiberalViewer Sunday live clip roundup, so who knows what's going to happen on Monday. I don't know, maybe it'll be an extraterrestrial alien invasion, or maybe the Justice and Policing Act won't be weak tea, it'll be keeping it 100. But anyway, I want to move on to my next clip, which is one of the 3 Trump administration officials who came on the Sunday morning news analysis shows to defend the Trump administration. This is the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Ben Carson, who ran against Trump, but now is a Trump administration official, talking about systemic racism to Jake Tapper in a clip I will talk about with you after we watch it together over here.
Let's talk about policy. Do you think systemic racism is a problem in law enforcement agencies in the United States?
Let's say this. I grew up at a time when there was real systemic racism. I remember as an 8th grade student, I was the only black student. I got the highest academic achievement, and the teacher got up and berated the other students. They weren't trying hard enough because a black kid was number 1. And that kind of thing was not uncommon when I was growing up. That kind of thing is very uncommon now. Are there still racists around? Absolutely. There were yesterday, there are today, and there will be tomorrow, you know. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight it. And this is an opportune time right now. People are concentrating on this. We can't let this moment slip away. You know, we need to deal with some of the issues in the police departments. But this is an easy time to do it. You know, we have policemen who are rogue. The vast majority of policemen are wonderful. But you have some who are rogues, and they can go from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction. and nobody does anything about it. They can be wearing body cameras. There are things that can be done, but we need to come to mutual solutions about this, and now is the time to do it. Everybody's concentrating on it. Let's not let this moment slip away. At the same time, we must be very vigilant about these groups of anarchists who destroy the livelihoods of the very people that they claim to be trying to help. Let's not be fooled. Let's not be seduced into accepting silly things that make absolutely no sense because we want to honor somebody. Let's just make sure that we think this thing through. Think about the consequences. You want to abolish police departments? Are you kidding me? What happens if you do that? Everybody goes out and arms themselves. They start hiring vigilante groups to protect them. We have total chaos going on. You know, that makes absolutely no sense.
The country's talked a lot about this week about the proper way to protest.
So there you see the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development talking about defunding the police, kind of abolishing the police, which is a caricature of what defund the police means. But I wanted to show that clip juxtaposed with Jake Tapper talking with Karen Bass, the chair of the House Congressional Black Caucus. And I also wanted to juxtapose it with a couple other clips of Trump administration officials trying to answer the question about systemic racism. I think the clip after next, Martha Raddatz talking to Chad Wolf, the acting Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, is actually giving it the best context. But this next clip is actually the Attorney General, Bill Barr, or some people say Trump's Roy Cohn, his personal attorney, pretending to be the Attorney General, asked about systemic racism in policing and saying, well, there's racism in America, but I don't know about in policing. In the clip I will talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Do you believe there is systemic racism in law enforcement?
I think there's racism in the United States still, but I don't think that the law enforcement system is systemically racist. I understand the distrust, however, of the African American community given the history in this country. I think we have to recognize that for most of our history, our institutions were explicitly racist. Since the 1960s, I think we've been in a phase of reforming our institutions and making sure that they're in sync with our laws and aren't fighting a rearguard action to impose inequities.
And you think that's working?
I think the reform is a difficult task, but I think it is working and progress has been made. I think one of the best examples is the military. The military used to be explicitly racist institution, and now I think it's in the vanguard of bringing the races together and providing equal opportunity. I think law enforcement has been going through the same process.
Do you think there should be some tweaking of the rules, reduced immunity to go after some of the bad cops?
I don't think you need to reduce immunity to go after the bad cops, because that would result certainly in police pulling back. Policing is the toughest job in the country, and I frankly think that we have generally the vast overwhelming majority of police are good people. They're civic-minded people who believe in serving the public. They do so bravely. They do so righteously.
But the bad cops?
I think that there are instances of bad cops, and I think we have to be careful about automatically assuming that the actions of an individual necessarily mean that their organization is rotten. All organizations have people who engage in misconduct, and you sometimes have to be careful as to when you ascribe that to the whole organization and when it really is some errant member who isn't following the rules.
But doesn't the opening the pattern of practice investigation into a place like Minneapolis, where there are questions about the broader issues with policing, it wasn't just the one officer, Wouldn't that answer that question?
Well, that's exactly the reaction that I think has been a problem in the past, which is it just, again, just reacting to this incident by immediately putting the department under investigation doesn't necessarily result in improving the situation. But I would say that in the first instance, the governor has announced an investigation of the police department. The Governor Walz, a Democratic governor, is investigating the police department. The Attorney General of Minnesota is looking into the police department. We stand ready to act if we think it's necessary, but I don't think necessarily starting a pattern of practice investigation at this stage is warranted. Another thing is we have to look at some of the evidence. I mean, people, the fact is that the criminal justice system at both the state and the federal level moved instantaneously on this, and we moved quickly with our investigation. But we still have to look into what kind of use of force policies are used in that department, what the training has been, and things like that. That's not something we can do overnight.
Coming up after our break.
And like I said, there's an even longer Bill Barr interview on the CBS News Face the Nation program or YouTube channel at the link I put down in the video description. I don't know what to say. Well, I do know a few things to say about what Bill Barr just said about, there is still racism in America, but not systemic racism in the police department. Doesn't really deal with how police departments were set up for racist reasons to begin with, and then talks about possibly the real problem being that we're too quick to investigate the police. There's too much accountability. That seems totally wrong. And you can look at many videos I've made about work I've done over the last several years to increase the amount of police accountability to support my argument there. But in the last two clips, you saw Jake Tapper on CNN and Margaret Brennan on CBS News's Face the Nation ask guests from the Trump administration about whether there was systemic racism. Martha Raddatz does the same thing with acting Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, in this next clip. But I think she does the best job by framing it with clips of cops engaging in police misconduct. Multiple clips just from the last few days, because there have been so many protests that have created so many videos of police misconduct. And anyway, I will talk about all of that a little more after we watch that penultimate newsmaker clip. Martha Raddatz cross-examining Chad Wolf this morning on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch together over here.
In the last few days. Now, look, the law enforcement is a difficult job, and there were senseless acts of violence against some officers, certainly establishments as well. But these protests were prompted because of the violent death of George Floyd by police officers. And there's now fresh outrage because of the way some of those protesters have been treated by law enforcement. I want to show you just a few examples.
You're not doing anything. Not doing anything.
And now you see what's going on now. Now there's just a lot of violence.
What is your reaction to that, Mr. Secretary?
Just north of the White House here.
Well, let me first say that the outrage that Americans are feeling today about the death of George Floyd is very real, it's very legitimate, and we need to address that. And I think the president has been very clear about that. We need to make sure that those that are responsible are held accountable, brought to justice, and we are doing just that. And I think you've seen the justice system move pretty quickly on that front all those police officers have been arrested and charges have been filed. So I think we need to state that first and foremost. But again, what we see across the board, by and large, is law enforcement doing their job. Yes, there are individuals in every profession that are perhaps criminals, that are perhaps abusing their authority, and we need to address that. And again, we've been very.
But how do you address that when you look at those images?
Let me just say that for DHS, this hits home. We had a federal protective officer last Friday, over a week ago, targeted and assassinated, shot in the head as he's responding to a protest. So this hits very close to home for the Department of Homeland Security. So when we talk about attacks on law enforcement, it's not an abstract idea. We are seeing them being targeted, and we need to make sure that the violence that's going on in cities across America, and again, it's diminished, I acknowledge that, it does not continue. And so that's a real concern, that law enforcement who are sent out there and do their job every day, protecting the American people every day, they have a right to do their job and to go home back to their families safe.
Mr. Secretary, those are indeed terrible examples, but I want to go back to the examples I showed you. Do those disturb you? These are public servants who are trained to supposedly meet protesters, not beat them up.
Absolutely. So again, as I indicated, I think you need to make sure that all law enforcement is acting correctly, or doing their jobs correctly, and when they're not, they need to be held accountable. So some of the images that you showed, as well as others, we need to make sure that we investigate. And again, if the evidence shows that they did not do their job correctly, they did not do the way they were trained to do, we need to hold them accountable. That's what we're doing in the George Floyd case. Again, the president has directed the Department of Justice to launch a civil rights investigation there. So there's a number of steps we're doing. We'll continue to do that. I think we can always do better. We can do more. But again, we need to also focus, while we're focusing on some of the police, we also need to focus on what has occurred over the last week in cities across America, burning churches, defacing monuments. We cannot let that go on. And so I think as we talk about what the police is doing, we also need to talk about what they're up against every day as well.
And Mr. Secretary, George Floyd isn't the only Black American who was killed by police. In fact, Black Americans are killed by police at more than twice the rate of white Americans. An Axios Ipsos poll found 77% of whites say they trust local police, compared with 36% of African Americans. Do you think there is a problem with systemic racism in policing in the United States?
I do not think that we have a systemic racism problem with law enforcement officers across this country. Do I acknowledge that there are some law enforcement officers that abuse their job? Yes. And again, we need to hold those accountable. And I would say that there are individuals in every profession across this country that probably abuse their authority and their power, and we need to hold them accountable. Can we do better? Can we do more? Can we continue to do more in the law enforcement arena, outreach to our communities, particularly those that feel slighted or absolutely. And so I think there's always things that we can do more. But again, I think painting law enforcement with a broad brush of systemic racism is really a disservice to the men and women who put on the badge, the uniform every day, risk their lives every day to protect the American people, to protect them so that they can go to school, they can have a business, and come home safe to their families. So I think we need to keep that in mind as well.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning, Mr. Secretary.
So, like I said, I thought Martha Raddatz did the best job of asking the systemic racism question in the context of multiple clips about police brutality, and it was that clip 14 from Martha Raddatz, if you're following along on the clip list, was a much better cross-examination of Chad Wolf, the acting Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, than Kris Wallace did back in clip number 8. But before I finish, I want to show Val Demmings, the representative from Florida, who was one of the impeachment managers against Donald Trump from the House, who is apparently one of the top contenders to be Joe Biden's vice presidential candidate, since he just clinched the Democratic presidential nomination. Personally, I think Val Demmings, like Kamala Harris, may have too strong a law enforcement background for my taste, but I think she does a good job of refuting some of what you heard from Chad Wolf there about systemic racism when explicitly asked by Martha Raddatz in the final news clip I will talk about with you a little more before we finish the show together after this clip.
Than just a budget. But I want you to know we will not be increasing our police budget. Our city, through our city administrative officer, identified $250 million.
Oh, I forgot to say this clip starts with a clip of, showing Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, talking sort of about defunding the police, but never mentions defunding the police. Defunding the police was briefly mentioned in like the last 5 minutes of ABC News' This Week. They had their justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, who happens to be black, I don't know if that's coincidental, explain what defunding the police means at the very end of the program. It's sort of like alluded to by the Eric Garcetti clip at the beginning of this clip that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch together over here.
Than just a budget. But I want you to know we will not be increasing our police budget. Our city, through our city administrative officer, identified $250 million in cuts so we could invest in jobs, in health, in education, and in healing. And that those dollars need to be focused on our black community.
LA Mayor Eric Garcetti discussing his plans to redirect up to $150 million from the police department, using that money instead to fund programs to help underserved communities. It's one of many police reform efforts underway in the wake of George Floyd's killing. For more, let's bring in Florida Congresswoman and former Orlando Police Chief Val Demmings. Good morning, Congresswoman. I want to first get your reaction to what Acting Secretary Wolf said about saying there's no systemic racism in police departments.
Well, good morning, Martha. It's great to be with you. And I did hear the Secretary's statement. Look, if we're going to solve some of America's toughest problems, we've got to be painfully honest about what those problems are. And we know that we have been fighting systemic racism in this country for 400 years. We know that it has reared its ugly heads in law enforcement agencies, in housing, in education, and too many other places. And so while I heard what the Secretary said, we have a lot of work to do, and systemic racism is always the ghost in the room.
As a former law enforcement officer and police chief, what's gone through your mind?
So that's the final news clip, and I'm not a supporter of a former cop or former prosecutor who didn't fight against mass incarceration. I don't know that much about Val Demmings' record, but I know about Kamala Harris's record here in California, which is why I don't think she would be my favorite vice presidential choice for Joe Biden, but I think she at least refuted some of what you heard from Acting Secretary of Department of Homeland Security Chad Wolf in the previous clip. I did want to thank all the Super Chat contributors during the show. I took a screen grab of that, although I think there was one more since I did it. Here's the screen grab. So thank you to all of you who supported the program that way. And then Lulu Girl also gave a $9.99 contribution after that screen grab. So thanks for that, Lulu Girl. I hope I responded to those comments along the way. And I did promise a Dash and Sandy clip at the end, a dandy clip, as they say. This is a edited together clip from this morning of Dash and Sandy. I tried to get them to interact in the hallway right over there, and you will hear off camera Sandy doing the Sandy howl. I don't think anyone's ever heard the Sandy howl because she wanted to be fed, so it was like, "Arr, arr, arr, arr." That's well, you'll hear it, and I will talk about that a little more with you before I show the bonus Dash solo clip at the end. But here's Dash and Sandy. You did hear the Sandy howl, but this has been kind of an intense topic. It's been an intense several weeks. COVID-19, the George Floyd protests, the move towards defunding the police, the Trump attempt to put active military members on the streets of the United States, which is like a threat to the Constitution, as Jim Mattis, his former defense secretary, said, and many other military members and former military members have said. It's been a big week, a stressful week for a lot of people, and so I thought I would end with this solo Dash clip. I call it the Dash Mew, which I put on a loop because if you're having some stress, you might want... This is only a 2-second clip, but I think I'm going to play it several times because every time I watch it, it sort of calms me down to finish the program over here. So what do you think? Was that a worth putting on a loop? That was some vocalization from Dash. I actually hear somebody off in the distance. I think it might be Dash. But anyway, that's the end of the program. I appreciate all of you for joining me. I hope you appreciate the 8 to 10 hours I spent this Sunday and every Sunday for more than 7 years now, picking out the best clips from the Big 5 corporate outlets, adding my political commentary and media criticism and some other things like that looping meow from Dash. And anyway, I guess I did upload a clip on, was it Monday or Tuesday, about how even Fox News was criticizing, I think it was Tuesday morning, Fox News criticizing Trump for gassing peaceful protesters. But maybe I'll upload a video like that this week, or if not, I will be back next Sunday and every Sunday for at least the rest of 2020. Hopefully in 5 months we will be done with Donald Trump, or at least he will not have won the November 3rd election. That will be when I will be able to start winding down this program, maybe. I don't know. I'll talk about all of that with you after the November 3rd election, but I'll definitely be here through 2020, and until I have some reason to upload a video, or until next Sunday, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.